This is Nahaz, and men lie, women lie, but stats don't lie. The 7.07 Dueling Fates update had its patch notes released last Monday while I was flying back from Germany, and the patch itself is now live. So I wanted to give you guys a video here with my overall impressions. We're going to talk sort of overarching themes of the patch, ways in which I think the game will feel and play different as this 7.07 rolls onward. I am planning to do another video early next week with thoughts on specific new items and new heroes. We'll get into a little bit of that at the tail end of this one, but I'm going to save most of my micro level comments for that one. Okay, so in terms of big ideas, how is 7.07 going to play out differently? I think the single biggest thing and the theme of most of the overarching changes is an increased emphasis on laning mechanics, 1v1s, and on early conflicts that are going to occur around the map, specifically away from the mid lane. The removal of Poor Man's Shield and Iron Talon is sort of case in point. Poor Man's Shield, an item that primarily allows melee heroes, predominantly agi melees, to stand in lane against ranged opponents and be able to CS. That item is now entirely out of the game, pretty rare in this area of Dota. Iron Talon, obviously much more focused on jungling heroes or on efficiently farming neutrals. That item is gone as well. The armor formula is reworked. This is a change that most of the time you're not going to notice too much if you're just casually playing the game. The most notable impact of this, as we'll talk about, is I think number one, there are a few heroes that have high base armor like Ogre Magi that are going to feel a little bit less tanky at the beginning of the game, and there are a few items like Assault Cuirass, Plate Mail, etc. that provide flat bonuses to armor that are going to be a little bit less effective now as the game goes on. Denies are now quite a bit more punishing. It used to be that denies operated on sort of a conservation of resources type principle where the person denying would actually get 30% of the XP of that creep for doing the denying, but the person being denied would still get 70% of that XP. That's now changed. When a creep is denied, 50% of its XP is lost outright, and the remainder is split evenly between the denier and the deniee. So potentially denies of those melee creeps in the first couple of creep waves mid are going to be quite significant now in terms of the level progression of those mid heroes. Neutrals no longer spawn at 30 seconds on the game clock. They now start spawning at a minute. It's a pretty targeted nerf toward Chen and Enchantress, potentially affects Doom as well. I'm not a big fan of this change because of the way that it affects those first two heroes in particular, but again, it's going to mean that those heroes are not able to come with the Wildkin or that annoying Harpy and threaten the mid lane super early. All heroes get a TP scroll, but that TP scroll starts on cooldown at the beginning of the game. It's a net loss for, now a lot of people would say, okay, free TPs, that benefits supports. It actually doesn't, because the discount in terms of no longer having to buy a TP scroll, almost all high-level supports in the previous patch were buying TPs and using them at the very start of the game to get out and place wards, all right? They no longer have to buy that TP, but that is offset by what I call the support tax, in that smokes, obs wards are more costly at the beginning of the game, and the courier is now 200 instead of 100. So the money that they're saving with that quote-unquote free TP scroll is being more than offset in terms of these other items being more costly. Also, they can no longer instantly TP out to those ward spots and place those wards unmolested. There's a lot more likelihood they're going to have to walk out. There's a lot more likelihood to be level 1 fights occurring over those common ward spots. D wards are going to be, at least prima facie, more frequent. So I think that definitely hurts supports at the very beginning of the game. There is a little bit of a bone thrown to the supports in that you no longer have to pay for the courier upgrade. It now auto upgrades at 3 minutes, and this is something I've been saying for a very long time. It is very easy to stop the problem of courier feeding in Dota 2. You just restrict couriers being bought, and that's not the case. You can no longer buy more than one courier per team. This is a change that took way too long to happen, but it is a good one. I do think the game should be faster paced overall. The removal of base shrines, this is something that we talked about in one of my videos, a couple of my videos actually in previous versions, that the 25 to 35 minute period of the game had become kind of dead, that between respawn talents and base shrines, it was very, very hard to break high ground prior to 35 minutes without just like this massive, like ridiculous 20K lead. Base shrines are now gone entirely after being decreased in number in the previous version. And after adding, in the last patch, the cheese got bumped up to the second Roshan from the third and later. And now, not only does cheese spawn with the second Roshan, but in addition to Aegis and cheese starting with the third Roshan, you get what's called a refresher shard. That's an item that acts as a single-use 0 mana cost refresher orb for some heroes. So again, that's all of this is going toward, we're giving teams with a lead and the ability to control the Roshan pit more tools to be able to end the game earlier on. Together with the laning changes, I think you're going to see more snowballing. There is a little bit of a change in the net worth factor where you're going to see supports get a little bit more gold relative to super farmed carries from AoE bounties. That offsets both the support tax and the snowball factor, but I still think games are going to feel a little bit more snowbally on average. And the big advantage, the big difference, I think, as we'll talk about in some of these subsequent slides, is if you watched Dota a year or two ago, it was almost always the case that you'd see these 1v1 mid matchups, and the mids would almost have at least 4, maybe 5 creep waves to establish some kind of advantage over the opposing mid before those support ganks started to come hot and heavy. And I think you're going to see the return of that, where in addition to mechanics changes that emphasize 1v1 laning, you're going to see the objectives have been reworked around the map to pull supports and other heroes more toward the side lanes away from mid. So I think you're going to see a lot more 1v1 mid matchups. Should make Sumail, Miracle, and others very happy. I do think Radiant should have less of an advantage. This was something that I felt kind of flew under the radar as 7.06 went on, is that the game had become very Radiant favored. I think some of the changes to the map mitigate that. We will talk as well about some of the stat reworks. Iron Talon and Poor Man's Shield are gone. Iron Talon's fairly obvious. That item had been kind of in decline at the pro level anyway. Puppy was still building it on his Night Stalker, but overall builds of that item were way down in high level pro play. You know, you can see really the only heroes that were building this in pubs were Legion Commander and Bloodseeker anyway. Jungling is all but dead between Iron Talon and the neutral spawns being reworked. This actually makes me a little sad. Jungling is dead. Again, increased emphasis on lanes. Poor Man's Shield is, of the two, a much bigger deal if you care, like I do, mostly about the pro scene. You had seen Poor Man's Shields being used and increasingly used to offset laning disadvantages of melee heroes against ranged heroes, particularly agi melee heroes like Ember, PL, etc. And in fact, you saw in a couple of games at ESL, Secret actually ran 3 PMSs, including in the last game against VP of the finals. They ran an Ember, Mag, PL, Tricore. All 3 of them built PMS at the beginning. That didn't work out because mid one's Ember was forced into the offlane. But again, this had become common enough. I have it on pretty good authority that at least one Valve employee actually went around and asked at ESL a bunch of pro players if you could remove one item from the game, which would it be? And it was surprisingly well over half of pro players actually said Poor Man's Shield. They said it distorts a lot of the early laning matchups. It doesn't build into anything. The item isn't relevant as the game goes on. It just kind of affects laning balance. And I mean, I think that's fair. I don't necessarily agree, but that item is gone. And so you're going to see ranged heroes. That plus the deny change means that ranged heroes are going to have a much bigger relative advantage compared to melee. Bloodseeker is no longer going to auto win a lot of his lanes. He's probably the single hero, if you look at the state of the meta at the end of the last patch, that is affected most by the PMS removal, but there are plenty to go around. Ember is one of them as well. Interestingly enough, most of the laning counters to Ember were actually melee heroes. If you think about the Monkey King, Ursa, Juggernaut, potentially, those were the heroes that Ember was more worried about going up against in lane. I think the hard counters are much more now. The Quap, the Invoker, etc. Ranged heroes are going to do a lot better, relatively speaking. Armor, this is something, so I played around with some of the values here in a spreadsheet. There are actually two offsetting changes. So each point of armor gives you 5% of your base HP in terms of increased effective hit points against physical damage, where it used to give 6%. So each point of armor is less effective, but you now get more armor per point of agi as the game goes on. So you used to get 1 armor every 7 agility. You now get 1 armor every 6 agility. Most of the time, these two changes are at least approximately going to offset. There was a misconception when people first started reading the patch notes. A lot of people had noticed that most of the structures in the game, tier 1 and tier 2 towers, etc., had their armor values adjusted upward. In most cases, those armor values are simply parity with the new system. So if you look under the old armor system, a tier 1 tower had 14 armor. That equated to about 45.7% damage resistance. It now had 17 armor. But it now has 3 more armor, but because each point of armor is less effective, it gives you almost exactly the same damage resistance. Or if you're like me and you like to think about it this way, tier 1 towers have almost exactly the same effective hit points against physical damage as they did before. The two big differences are going to be, so number one, heroes at the beginning of the game that have most of their armor coming from base armor. So Ogre starts the game with 8 armor, so almost exactly 8, 7.96 in the previous patch. He now starts the game with slightly higher with 8.33 because he's getting a little bit more armor from his agi, even though it's very small. But because these two values are approximately the same and each point of armor is a little bit less effective, he loses about almost exactly 40 effective HP against physical damage. So this is like, you think about it like 40, 41. This is almost 1 right click. All right. Ogre is 1 right click less tanky against physical damage, which, that can be relevant. Okay. If you think about it the other extreme, if you look at a level 25 Terrorblade, he had a displayed value of 21 armor in the previous patch. That equated to just under 3k effective HP against physical damage. He now has slightly higher displayed armor, but slightly lower EHP. Loses about 125 effective HP, which again, as a percentage of his total HP pool at that point in the game, is fairly small. It's going to be about 1 right click from the enemy carry, but that's much less significant because you're going to be getting right clicked by the number of heroes that are going to do that with 1 right click later in the game are going to be a lot smaller than the heroes that can do 40 damage to you with a right click early in the game. This is also moderate nerf to items providing flat armor bonuses like your ACs, like your plate mails, Shivas, etc. That's fine. Okay. Radiant advantage. So this is something that I think a lot of people weren't necessarily aware of, but I tweeted this out in the final 30 days of 7.06F. Every hero, if you broke MMR into 5 skill categories from below 2k to 5k and above, every single hero in every one of those 5 MMR categories had a higher win rate as Radiant than as Dire. That had been true at some points previously in Dota 2 pubs, but this advantage was pretty substantial when you look at overall, a 54-46 split. It doesn't sound like a lot, but this is over hundreds of thousands of games, pub matches. So this is statistically significant for sure. And if you looked at the highest level of Dota's, highest levels of Dota, that advantage had been, if anything, more pronounced. If you add up Starladder and ESL, where Radiant ended up having a very large winning record, to PGL, where it was pretty close to 50-50, you still get about a 62% Radiant advantage. That is substantial in terms of an advantage in pro matches. And so there's always this confounding factor where you're not sure that, okay, is it just that the best teams are playing Radiant? And one way I think you can look at that is to just go, well, when teams had selection priority, what did they pick? And this is something that Knoxville did for me at ESL. He kept track of in 26 of our matches at ESL. I have data for, with selection priority, what did teams choose, and then what did the other team pick in response. So when they had selection priority out of 26 matches, 18 teams with selection priority chose to be either first or second, with a fairly even split among first pick or second pick. First pick had a slight advantage, but I think a lower win rate. I'll need to check that. It is telling to me, though, of the remaining 8 teams that actually chose to pick side with selection priority, all 8 of them chose Radiant, none picked Dire. And of the 18 teams, so when the opponent chose pick order, the other team got to choose side, and of the 18 teams without selection priority who ended up choosing side, it was 15-3, Radiant over Dire. So not only did Radiant have this massive win rate, but there was also a massive preference shown to Dire by teams when they had the choice at the highest levels. Okay, so why was this? This is a comment that I made in passing at ESL that I wanted to explain a little bit in a video. This is an opportune time to explain it anyway. The comment that I made on the panel at ESL was that I felt like there was this trio of Dire towers, the tier 1, tier 2 on the top lane of Dire and the tier 1 in the mid lane, and that if Radiant could ever take these 3 towers, all right, that Dire pretty much was denied control of this upper left part of the map. And that's the single biggest map asymmetry in Dota. Obviously, the lower left and upper right quadrants are roughly equivalent in terms of their relevance. You got the mid lane towers and you've got the ancients and the base. Fine. The biggest symmetry in the Dota 2 map is lower right to upper left. It used to be when the Roche Pit was down here, lower right was more important. That's part of how you saw CDEC get so far at TI5, was by exploiting that idea. It's now the case, because the Roche Pit is up here, that the upper left is much more important. And if you look, so it's not just these 3 towers that I was talking about on the panel. If you look at Radiant's major vectors into those objectives, so how does Radiant threaten both the tier 1 and tier 2 towers top and the big spire ward in the Dire jungle from the river? Those objectives, those vectors, they do path through low ground, but with the exception of the spire ward, 2 of the 3 low ground pathings are pretty short. You can get up to that high ground bounty room spot fairly quickly after you climb up from the river, and there's really no cover offered by the Dire Shrine. You contrast with the Radiant side of the map, and whether or not you're comparing, if you want to compare to the Radiant jungle, 2 of the 3 big approach vectors, we're not going to count the Radiant bottom tier 1 tower, because most teams are just kind of throwing that tower away anyway. Again, this is by far the least relevant area of the map to begin with. But if you look at the Radiant tier 2 bottom tower and the Spire Ward spot, the 2 mid-game objectives that are relevant in the Radiant jungle, the approaches for both of those, the 2 most direct approaches for both of those, are covered by the Radiant safe lane shrine. And if you look at the offlane towers, if you want to go just upper left quadrant instead, the approaches, the most direct approaches to both the Radiant top lanes, tier 1 and tier 2 towers, are covered by the top lane shrine as well. So strategically, Radiant in a lot of cases is going to have a very big advantage in terms of defending those objectives. This, by contrast, this offlane shrine of Dire's, as the game goes on, just feels, it protects the Dire secret chop, which is fine, but it doesn't really, it feels increasingly irrelevant as the game goes on. Most of the time, if the Radiant team is threatening this part of the map, all right, it's in one push. Most Radiant teams will take the Dire offlane tier 1 and tier 2 towers in one big push and never visit this area of the map again. So this Dire Shrine felt irrelevant, whereas these two Radiant shrines, really, you were seeing fights at those shrines consistently still later in the game. So what they did in 707 to offset this, for the offlane shrines, both here and here, they switched the location of the shrine and the bounty rune. And for the safe lane shrines, they move them deeper into the primary jungle. So that has the effect of placing the Dire Shrine here in the Dire jungle much more in a good position to cover Radiant's approaches to the tier 2 tower in the top lane and the Spire Ward. So I think Radiant is going to have a much harder time taking over the Dire jungle in the early part of the mid game. And the Radiant Shrine no longer provides nearly as direct cover in terms of Dire's approaches to the Radiant jungle objectives. So I think that's a good change. The other things that you're going to notice, these bounty runes are a lot more tightly clustered. We're going to talk about that in a second. In terms of asymmetries, it used to be that this bounty rune, this Radiant Jungle bounty rune, was the hardest bounty rune on the map for the enemy faction to contest. That asymmetry is greatly alleviated. It's now one ramp per side for all of these. I think even just on casual inspection, the map just appears much more symmetric now. This shrine, I said earlier that I felt like the offline shrine for Dire was pretty much irrelevant. At the very least, even if this bottom right part of the map isn't as relevant as the upper left, at the very least, Dire can actually use this shrine a lot more efficiently for farming, as it now offers very direct proximity to the ancient camp here, as well as 2 jungle camps on either side on the high ground. So I just feel like the map is a lot more balanced. In terms of the structure of the Dire jungle itself, let's actually look at a specific example, because I think a lot of people, they look at this 7.06 setup and they say, well, why would more high ground be a bad thing for Dire? Okay, so if you look at this, the Dire low ground, on the surface of things, Dire now has more low ground in its jungle. And so isn't that bad for Dire because farming their own jungle is riskier? I think the answer to that is definitely no. If you look at this particular fight, this happened to be in Keen versus SG in their best of 3 series last weekend at ESL. This was kind of a cool fight. What had happened is Keen were off to a very strong start. They had taken both the tier 1 and tier 2 top Dire towers. This fight happened right after Keen took the Dire top tier 2. They actually faked backed. All right, their Nature's Prophet, Dark's Nature's Prophet, had TP'd down to split push, so he wasn't going to be part of the fight. The remaining 4 Keen heroes were playing a little bit of a mind game. They'd actually faked back and smoked, trying to get a pick off, figuring that the Chaos Knight might be extending out into his own jungle to try and catch up in farm. Meanwhile, SG actually had a very good read on this. What they figured was that Prophet was probably going to try to split push, as he did, and that the Lifestealer or the Lina would probably try to take 1 or 2 of these jungle camps before they backed. They were right. They actually had vision. So as you can see, they get a perfect initiation here from the Batrider, but they're initiating from high with 4 of their heroes having to sit here on the low ground. This is Dire reclaiming their own jungle, having to initiate from low to high ground. If you think about that, basically the only 2 situations where Radiant would have to fight low to high ground going into their own jungle, one of them is up this ramp where you'd be fighting up into your own shrine, which is fine. The other one is up this ramp where you would at least be able to put a ward here on the high ground to spy out the fight much, much more easily from one of these 2 nooks in the trees. So it's really, to me, it feels like there is not a symmetric situation on the other side of the map where Radiant would have to be fighting uphill in terms of reclaiming its own jungle. The other thing, which I'll go back, didn't show as clearly on this previous slide is that there's now more room in the mid lane ramps are relatively narrower, and there's a little more room here on the dire high ground. This is something that the pros had been talking about back several patches, that it felt like because of the geometry of the map and because the path from the dire high ground here is much more direct down into the mid laners area than the path from the radiant high ground here, which is kind of around a bend. It felt like the radiant mid laner, it was easier to position yourself as a radiant mid laner to avoid ganks just by moving right to left than it was as a dire mid laner. And that particular map change is meant to offset that. So to place the radiant and dire mid laners on a little bit more of a level playing field vis-a-vis their lane positioning and avoiding ganks. So in general, this is the other effect that I was talking about. One of the things that you would see increasingly as 706 went on is that because of the location of these bounty runes, you see supports like GH that would basically rotate from bounty rune to bounty rune and just kind of gank mid on the way. Like Liquid would, there were games in the early days of 706 that Liquid would literally have GH build Tranquil Boots and early Windlace on all of his supports and just walk back and forth and claim bounty runes and just gank mid in between. And by changing the location of the 3 runes, the power-up runes down in the river and the bounty runes on either side of the jungles to be a little bit more tightly clustered, what you do is you pull heroes more toward the sides of the map. You create more situations where supports are going to start in these side lanes and spend more of their time contesting either this area or this area of the map rather than just always rotating through mid. And when you compound that with the sort of support tax that makes it less likely that you're going to see these super early smoke ganks mid from the supports, I think you're going to see more of a return to early metas where your mid laners are going to get at least 3, 4, 5, 6 creep waves to try and get an advantage over that opponent before the heavy support ganks start coming in. I think it was really smart on the team's part that along with these clustering rune changes, they actually moved the lane equilibrium slightly closer to the safe lane tier 1 towers at the beginning of the game. It forces the safe lane supports to have to make a choice between pulling and playing defensively for their carry under tower and coming out and contesting these runes. It makes it so that the off lane supports, especially on the dire side, they have a little bit more activity. It's much more likely, particularly on the dire side, okay, that offlane supports are going to be able to claim double bounty runes early in the game by manipulating the lane equilibrium in their favor. I think that's important because, again, short of putting another Roshan pit down in the lower right and having it be random where Roche spawns, you're never going to have the map be fully symmetric. So I think it's important that, especially in the early game, that supports have a little bit more incentive to spend their time contesting areas on this part of the map. And I think that moving the bounty runes changes that alone. And this is something you should definitely, even in your pubs, particularly if you're a support playing in the dire off lane or the radiant safe lane, be aggressive and go for those runes. Okay, there's no longer even a shrine here for dire. Okay, the shrine's all the way up here. So I think this patch is going to reward aggressive early support play. Still, that's one of the things you worry about. Okay, we want to have less mid ganks, but we still don't want to go back to this static support meta where it's like, you're a support, go pull. That's your entire life, okay? I think they've done that by creating more of an incentive to contest tightly these tighter areas of the map. And that's also going to pull heroes away from mid. You might actually see mid heroes rotating toward the river, through the river toward the bottom lanes, rather than, if there's a mid rotation now, it's almost exclusively like these TP rotations, the same rotations that you see from other lanes, okay? So I like these changes to the map overall. Refresher shard, again, In previous versions of the 7.0 series of patches, I talked about 25 to 35 minutes becoming kind of a dead area where because of the respawn talents, the lots and lots of shrines in the base, it was very, very hard to break high ground without like a 20k gold advantage at 25 to 35 minutes. Progressively, you've seen the respawn talents eliminated. You've seen the number of base shrines cut back. In this patch, they've been eliminated entirely. So now the 2 outer shrines are all. And this refresher shard, starting with, it's also in the last patch you saw Cheese move to 2nd Roshan spawn from 3rd. So again, teams that get Roshan are going to have more tools to end the game early. This is definitely continuing in that theme. Okay, it's making sure that teams now, that 3rd Roshan, which you're going to see as early as 30-35 minutes in some games, probably most of the time it's going to be about probably 40 to 45 in most pro games, but you're going to see it early in some. And that team that establishes control of the Roche Pit, that SG Keen game that we talked about earlier, that was a game where Keen actually had the 3rd Roche quite early. That team is going to have yet another tool with which to end the game. It's also, to me, a very smart way of buffing these heroes that are reliant on long cooldown abilities or on big ultimates like Tidehunter. We had talked increasingly, this goes back at least 1, if not 2 TIs now. We talked about Pro Dota increasingly becoming like a skirmish-oriented game where heroes with these long CDs were very punishable because they were forced to concede multiple objectives if the enemy team saw that that ultimate was down. You have seen more of an emphasis on 5-manning as objective Dota has become more prominent. Liquid deserves a lot of credit for bringing that back, but I think this is a very, very nice buff for heroes that are reliant on their long CD ultis, gives them sort of that extra tool that makes them more of a high ground threat. And we have already had at least 1 triple ultimate cast in a pro game. Solo did it earlier today against Fnatic. He picked up a refresher shard and an orb on his Shadow Shaman, went and dropped 3 sets of wards in the Dire base at top racks, just destroyed their base almost instantly. It was awesome. Solo, you earned that Mercedes. Anyway, mana regen. So mana and HP regen both been reworked along with the introduction of some perks attached to specific stats. The mana and HP regen, these are for all heroes. So we'll talk about the perks that apply only for intelligence, strength, and agility heroes. These are for all heroes. The big difference, without going through the formula line by line, the big difference now is that the scaling of mana regen with int is a little bit lower, but every single source of mana regen in the game, every bit of mana regen in the game is now scaled by your hero's intelligence, okay? So it used to be that items either gave you a percentage bonus to your mana regen, a flat bonus to your mana regen that got added on and didn't depend on your hero's int, or in the case of like Bloodstone gave you both, okay? Now, every single source of mana regen is in here inside the parentheses. It gets scaled by your int. Now, the way in which it gets scaled by your int is smaller initially. So what that means is that ignoring items in the early game, most heroes will actually get slightly higher mana regen with this new formula, okay? It starts off at a higher base value for most heroes, okay? Although Valve has warned that this 0.9 base value will get adjusted in the future across different heroes, most heroes are actually going to have slightly higher mana regen to play around with at level 1. However, as the game goes on, the effectiveness of different mana regen bonus items is going to vary with hero identity. So Storm and Lina are going to get more mana regen per Bloodstone charge than, say, Timbersaw. Now, the first thing I did when I saw this change is I played around with it in a spreadsheet. I took like level 10 Storm with Bloodstone, level 10 Lina with Bloodstone, level 15 Storm with Orchid and Bloodstone, level 25 Storm with Shiva's, Orchid, Bloodstone, Sheepstick. For practical purposes, most of the values that you're going to see are actually going to be pretty similar. Like it's fairly unusual for it to make a difference of more than like 10 mana regen either way, old versus new. And again, like in general, low int heroes are going to have lower mana regen. High int heroes are always going to have higher mana regen. but it's not going to be that different. The couple of exceptions to this, one big exception is late game Bloodstones, okay? Because the per charge regen on Bloodstone now scales with your int like everything else, it's possible to, as a Storm Spirit, if you have like 30 or 40 Bloodstone charges late game and you die, the difference in your mana regen after you die is going to be very, very big. So it's actually, Bloodstone becomes much more of a risky item in the late game than it was before, which I actually think is kind of cool. Most heroes aren't going to see too dramatic a difference. The other big difference, interestingly enough, is actually in the role of consumables. So I just tested this really quickly on a level 25 Skywrath Mage, and level 25 Skywrath Mage gets 10.9 mana regen per second over 50 seconds from Clarity. So he's actually, as opposed to the 190 flat mana he used to get from Clarity Potions in 706 and before, he's actually getting over 500 mana from that Clarity over 50 seconds. That's about a third, again, ignoring items, that's about a third of his base mana pool with 0 items. That's substantial. Similarly, Bottle, if you look at Bottle Charge, it gives him 57.9 total mana regen per second. Old Fountain regen, new Fountain regen is a little bit greater as a percentage of your mana pool, but old Fountain regen was exactly 75 for this hero in this situation. So your bottle regen is actually very close to Fountain regen. 3 bottle charges now give Sky more than 400 mana. So consumables are potentially relevant, especially mana consumables are going to be relevant much later into the game for farming purposes, potentially even for high ground pushing purposes relative to before. So it used to be kind of a cute thing that you'd see people like Envy hold on to their bottles in order to bottle a DD rune for high ground pushes. I actually think that that's going to be a lot more common, and that you should definitely, like in the mid and late game in your pubs, be it for farming purposes, for farming efficiency with your nukes, or for pushing high ground, if you have a spare backpack slot, mid or late game, you should at least be carrying a couple of Clarities, if not a bottle as well for certain heroes. All right, so that I think is a big difference. For relevant values, the health regen formula got reworked along similar lines, but just because of the particular formula, the percentage difference is not as large. You have to go, so before, Skywrath is actually not the highest int hero at 25, that's Pugna. Centaur is by far the largest strength hero at 25, and if you just test it and or do the math, he's getting about twice as much total heal, about 800 HP from a healing salve at level 25 with no items. That's almost exactly twice the 400 HP he was getting before. So salves are also more effective late game, but on a percentage basis, they are less relatively effective. And there's the fact that if you need to use a salve, it's because you're probably getting hit or have been getting hit in the recent past, which means you're more likely to lose that regen relative to Clarities and bottles with the mana regen component, which can be used for farming purposes as well as for potentially to be able to sustain pushes. So I think the mana regen change is a little bit more relevant vis-a-vis consumables. Stat perks. So really quickly, 2 of these I like, 2 of them, 1 of them I don't. I really don't like the strength change. The strength heroes now get 0.15% per point of strength status resistance. That decreases the duration of disables like silence, stun, or slow, or disarm. I really dislike this change because it means that these heroes are the timing of spell combos is now not only going to have to vary by hero, but also vary as the game goes on. I really don't like that. I feel like individual heroes in Dota are hard enough to learn. I guess pros, you know, your Sumails and Arteezes or Miracles might be happy because, yay, my skill cap is even higher now. But if you want to play Invoker and hit those spell combos perfectly, which is hard enough for those plebs, you got to cast your spells 20% faster against a level 25 Centaur than you do against Shadow Shaman. To me, it's kind of a pain. Whatever. I wish they'd done something different here. The move speed change. Agi heroes get 0.06% move speed bonus per point of agi. That's actually, in most situations, you're really not going to feel that at all. The edge case for this is a level 25 Morphling, fully shifted, is 187 base agi without items. That equates to 11.2% move speed, which is still like 2/3 of Sanjin Yasha. It's not that big. With Boots of Travel, in addition to his base 285 move speed, that means he'd get 43 move speed on top. So for a total of 428, still nowhere near the cap of 550. And for most reasonable values, most level 25 or level 20, think like level 21 big item, most of the time with Treads or Phase or Arcanes, you're going to get around plus 20 move speed, which is about what you get from drums. So it's noticeable. It's a little bit of protection from late game agi carries like Ursa getting kited, but it's nothing too terribly huge. The biggest change I actually think might be this, that tanky int heroes are going to benefit a lot. 0.15% magic resistance is potentially a big deal, partially because strength heroes, as the game goes on, they're itemizing for armor and magic immunity and other things in addition to flat strength bonuses, whereas int heroes, as the game goes on, are more likely to build multiple items that give flat int bonuses like Orchid and Shivas and Sheepstick, and that's going to mean you're going to see very high values of int much more commonly. And your mega farm late game int heroes, this is potentially like 20 to 30% bonus magic resistance on top of what they already get. That's substantial. I like this a lot better than I do the status resist, by the way, because if you're playing the game, you already, when enemy heroes were buying hoods or pipes or no field on Rubik, whatever, you were already having to mentally adjust for magic resistance values varying across enemy heroes in terms of how much damage you needed to do to kill that enemy clockwork. That's fine. This, where you actually have to play, the timing of your spells actually has to change to get that perfect spell combo against different heroes as the game goes on. I don't know. I think that's an unnecessary layer of extra complexity. It's kind of a cool idea. I just don't like it personally. Again, we're going to do another one of these videos early next week. We'll talk about individual items. For now, I will just briefly say, don't build Meteor Hammer. It's absolutely garbage. Kaya, I think, is way overrated. I don't really like that item. I don't think it's efficient numerically. Diffusal Blade obviously got a huge nerf. It lost its purge. Still gets the slow. No longer has the charge limit, but on a bigger cooldown. I think Diffusal... Heroes that still built Diffusal as a first or second item, like PL or Monkey King, maybe Mirana, are still going to buy it. Anybody that built it as a utility item against Guardian Angel or similar buffs is no longer going to buy it. There are, however, other dispel options now introduced to offset that. I think Spirit Vessel is an awesome idea. It's a direct upgrade, particularly to the offensive capability of Urn of Shadows. I like that. Nullifier is like a cold snap effect that mutes instead of mini stuns and damages, so that enemy hero for a period of time, if they take any player damage, they're actually muted for a period of time. I think that's kind of a cool idea. This is potentially a core item. The Aeon Disc, I think, is really a strange idea. If you're below 80% health and take damage, you get a purge on your hero, and you get 2.5 seconds of complete invulnerability. I really dislike that. There's pretty much no sources of complete invulnerability in the game, like at all, other than Yules and such, and even that is then there are exceptions. So I kind of don't like this item in terms of its design concept. I guess I'm going to have to see it in some high-level matches before I can pass judgment, but it just seems really, really strange to me. Individual heroes, again, we'll talk about. Viper is the most obvious and I think the biggest beneficiary. Not only is he now one of only 4 sources of break, that is disabling enemy heroes' passives in the game. The other 3 being Doom, Shadow Demon's Demonic Purge, and Silver Edge. Viper was among the least strategically interesting heroes, and he now hard counters because of that. PA, Bristle, and a few others. The new Nether Toxin does that. It also provides, anytime you take a hero that's potentially a farming core like a Viper, and before he had absolutely 0 AoE, and now he at least has some AoE wave clear for farming and stat clearing that is significant, even though the damage on that isn't necessarily huge. 40 per second over like 8 to 10 seconds, that is nothing to laugh at. The AoE is much smaller than Acid Spray, but I think that's potentially very relevant. I actually think Viper is going to be at least until the I think he'll get toned down a little bit potentially in 7.07B, which I expect to hit in 2 or 3 weeks. And I think until that happens, he's probably going to be first phase material in a lot of these pro drafts. Anyway, thanks for listening. If you got this far, this video is already too long, so I'm going to cut it off here. We'll try and do a video early next week, talk about specific items, specific hero changes. Lots of really cool stuff going on out there in 7.07. Get out there in your pubs, have fun. I will talk to you guys next week with another edition of Stats Don't Lie.